I mentioned to you yesterday a couple of times that this class and this course material and so on is very Windows centric. Most of the commands, the tool suites, the software is oriented towards your Windows operating system environment, and specifically, we addressed items that are included in Windows 10 and Windows 11. Windows 11, of course, being the latest version that we have of the Windows operating system at this point in time. Believe it or not, there are other operating systems that are out there and that are beginning to, especially the Linux distributions, are beginning to sort of nip at the heels of Windows and to claim lots of that desktop space, which has for the last 25, 30 years now has been almost totally owned by Windows and the Windows applications and so on. I tell you, I'm a big fan of the Linux distributions, the Linux operating systems in general. But I'm a big fan of free stuff too. So the Linux distros themselves, for the most part, are completely open source. They are free to download, and they are all beginning to look, act, and feel like sort of a combination between the Windows desktop, the Android desktop they'll see on Android tablets and mobile phones, and iOS, the Apple desktop. Now, I told you guys yesterday, I'm not a strong Linux guy myself. I can navigate and work through Linux systems. I run 5 different Linux distributions on different computer systems for different purposes. But I did purchase this guy. This is not a commercial or an advertisement. This is the Linux for Dummies book. I got it from Amazon, of course. This is actually the 3rd version of it, and it's getting a little bit frayed here because I use it so much. That's the 3rd version of that book that I have owned, and I like it because it's actually 8 books in one. It gives you an introductory level um, uh, introduction for a function there, and introductory information about the Linux operating system, base level stuff. And it then slowly but surely moves into some more intermediate kind of functionality, and even then gives me some pretty high level stuff there as well. This is my Linux Bible now. It is my go-to reference guide, and I always have it sitting here on my desktop um, for the Linux distros that I run. Now we're going to go through this lesson pretty quickly, and I'm then going to give you some links to some of the modernized, and they call it the best of Linux distros for 2024-25. Now, in addition to the Windows operating system, we have several different others. This, of course, is your Mac OS. Beautiful operating system environment. They have the on their desktop here. It's called Virtual Windows. They don't call them Windows or virtual terminals. I'm sorry, virtual desktops. And inside of their Windows management functionality there, they call it mission control, where you can define and create and manage and manipulate multiple what looks like windows here. The same type of functionality as a Windows environment. Even the look and feel of the screens now are beginning to look much the same. Down along the bottom of the Mac screen here is they call it their docker, their dock station. And that's the same thing as your Windows taskbar, of course. That's where I can put my quick launch icons down there to start apps up. And of course, I can anchor them in the body of the windows here or down on the taskbar, either one. These individual windows here are manipulated just like the windows that we create in a Windows environment. iOS, there's actually 2 versions of it. There's the Mac OS operating system, which under the covers, it's a Unix-based operating system, even though it's proprietary. And then for the iPhone and the tablet devices, the iPad, it uses an iOS is the operating system. And they're not the same. It's 2 different operating systems. Now they look and act and feel much the same. But this Mac OS is for your iMac systems, your MacBook Pros. Of course, all of it is Apple. Apple Corporation owns all of it. But it's beautiful, beautiful visuals here on the Mac OS operating system. And I was telling you guys yesterday, this OS right here, I mean, from the metal up, was designed with multimedia development and presentation in mind. Okay, no doubt about it. It's an artistic type of OS. This is one of the Linux distributions that I run. This is Linux Ubuntu. There are about 2 dozen that are very commonly used now. Linux is completely open source, 100% free download. I'll go ahead and give you guys the link I was talking about here for the best known or most popular, whatever you want to call it. Let's see if they already published in here for 2025. Probably do. I run 5 different ones. I run the two different versions of the Linux Ubuntu. Okay, that's one of the most widely used ones you'll see right here. Okay, it has a couple of really slick looking graphic user interface overlays that you can get for those. These guys are often referred to as there's certain versions of Linux, and these are called Debian based Linux. There is actually a Linux Debian distribution, and there's several of the others like Ubuntu that are built upon that Debian framework, that Debian platform. It utilizes these guys by default utilize a desktop environment called GNOME, like garden gnomes. Really pretty. It's functional, much like the same Windows type is. There's the 9 best of 2025 here. Let's see where Ubuntu sits in that. Yep, there's Ubuntu, Fedora, Pop OS, Manjaro is another one. Kali Linux is one that I run. It is fine-tuned for penetration testing, ethical hacking kind of tasks. So I'm going to give you guys this link right here. Tuck that away, and when you get an opportunity, you might want to investigate some of these Linux distributions. I actually have on my website that I gave you guys a link to. There is a download link there that will allow you, it shows you the instructions on how to build a USB flash drive with a Linux distribution on it that you can boot your system up from. And you can run the Linux distro right off of that flash drive. Now, I mean, if you guys get into running some of your hypervisor software, where you can set up a virtual machine and run a Linux distro right in there. That's what I do now on my laptop. But the Linux Ubuntu here, you know, same sort of thing. You got your quick launch bar over here. You got menus, just like these guys up here, drop down menus. You have these virtual terminals or these virtual desktops, they call it. And you actually just tab between the virtual desktops and you can set them up and they look, act, and feel just like Windows. And if you guys have an Android phone or an iOS, looking at the relations of these things, the different icons, the graphic images, and so on, you'll start to notice that it's all starting to look and act to feel the same. Even some of the new Windows stuff is doing just that. Now, Google owns the Android operating system, and it also is open source. Google, they also, they create their Chromebook, the Chromebox, those devices for hooking up to internet. And the Chromebook is a very thin netbook kind of processor. And for a while, it ran a version of their operating system called Chromium. And it was not free. It's a proprietary to those Chromebook devices themselves. But there's your, iOS, your Apple phone and the iPad. And again, looks and acts and feels much like the Mac OS does. And we're seeing that same thing with Android. Okay. Now, Android, of course, just like Linux distributions, completely open source, free to download. And I'll tell you, you will be hard pressed to find a requirement for a certain application that you can't find a free app, probably 5 or 10 free application offerings for. And just think of, whatever app need you have. And inside the app stores that come with the Linux distributions, you'll find several applications that are completely free to download. They got good support with open source programmers. The file systems, I talked to you yesterday about the new technology file system, NTFS, that is the default on Windows environments now, especially as of the Windows 2000 server. The NTFS is in the Windows world is required for you to have your master boot record, the partition that has the BIOS and the master boot record on it. Prior versions of Windows use an older, we call it FAT32, file allocation table. Different means of setting up the file system on the older Windows boxes. And it's still used on, for instance, the old Windows 32 devices. Not many of those still around, but some of them are. And the Linux systems utilizes sort of a version of the file allocation table. It's called exFAT or EXT. And it is the extended version of it, the later version of the file allocation table on the Linux distros. Unlike the old file allocation table that didn't support things like encryption algorithms or file compression, things like that, the newer versions of the extended versions of it do. In most of your Linux distributions, they support a file system. It's called EXT3 and EXT4. EXT4 being the latest one that's supported. There it is, this guy right here. The fourth extended file system. And that's how it actually formats the disk. It's how it sets up the disk partitions. It's how it allocates the sector space, the track space on hard disk drives. How it actually sets up the addressability from the operating system to the file system and so on. And then Apple has their very own unique file system, the Apple file system APFS. And that is a newer version as well that has been updated with the implementation of the 64-bit processors that are being built into the Mac OS and those systems as well. When you go through an operating system installation, there's of course several ways we can do it. You can do an attended, operating system install or update. You can do unattended, and whichever of the operating systems you're installing or loading up, they will have some type of an install file collection, usually compressed to some degree, and then the file then runs like an executable and installs all the system files. And as you go through the installation, we'll look at this in a little more detail later, but as you go through the installation, it will, if you're doing a manual, for instance, it will pause along the way in several areas and ask you, the installer, questions about where do you want this file to, how do you want to set this up, so on and so on. You will find across different operating systems, there are very specific requirements on the way that the software needs to be structured, written, and then compiled into executable objects for a specific operating system. And you guys should be aware, you can't create a program for a Windows operating system environment and run it under a Linux or a Mac OS environment. Different application development kits, oftentimes different programming languages and underlying support functionality there. So there is compatibility issues across the board in between different operating systems and different application software, but it extends far beyond that. Even network incompatibility issues sometimes. Now we're seeing less and less of that. It's gotten to where now you will have this hybrid collection of all different kind of computer systems, and especially now that so many organizations have begun to gravitate towards web-based types of applications. Well, any system basically that can run a web browser can run just about any kind of web app that's out there, because of the way that the web technology service up the application functionality there. Okay. Now, in past years, I don't know if you guys remember way back when, but originally when Apple and Macintosh started producing their particular computer systems, if you wanted to get a printer to print with your Apple or your Mac device, it had to be one that was manufactured by Apple. Okay. And then the public at large began to realize, I think is what made them change their evil ways. They began to realize a printer is a printer. I mean, it takes some type of formatted information from an application running on a computer and then uses what we talked about yesterday, the printer definition language, PDL, to format it and present it so that the computer prints it in what's referred to as WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. What you see on your screen is how it's going to be formatted to look on the printer, right? Well, that's a driver functionality. So nowadays, I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of computer system you're running and what kind of operating system you're running. If you have the proper print driver, you can print to a printer from any of those, doesn't matter what it is. So it's more of a driver incompatibility thing than it was hardware incompatibility. So Apple was sort of forced the a larger community sort of forced their hand to it. Okay, we see your game here. You just start writing the proper print drivers, and everything will be okay. You see. So we also find, and there's not a large leap much anymore nowadays because these systems are beginning to look and act and feel much the same. Um, User training on these systems is, there are certain idiosyncrasies. There are certain things that are along the lines of terminology differences that people may have to learn. For instance, I was talking about the Windows management function and mission control in the Mac OS. Same thing, File Explorer, mission control. So and there's also there's different names and functions for the same kind of thing in Mac OS and Unix and Linux and Windows. Same function, a little bit different terminology there. Okay. So again, like in Windows, it's a window. In Mac OS and Unix, it's a virtual desktop, right? And Linux, same thing. So just a little bit of a leap there as far as terminology, our learning curve. Now, one thing we want to try to make sure that we don't get caught up in, and this is more of a network planning and systems operational systems planning thing. You don't want to be locked into a singular vendor. Vendor lock's what we call it. Plus, we find when people, especially when people, new employees come to an organization, their background may have been they've been raised on Mac systems. So in some cases, especially based on the job function they're hired for, it just may make more sense. Set them up with a MacBook Pro or a Mac OS system for doing the marketing and the sales and the web development and things like that. So it's much simpler now to target the job function with very specific types of hardware configurations and software configurations. Um, but because again, they're almost all of them are nearly cross compatible. Now you have to understand too, and I mentioned this earlier in the week as well. Every system, doesn't matter what it is, every system has a sunset date. When we start installing, implementing new systems, regardless of the manufacturer, regardless of the operating system, we have to understand what that sunset date is and plan for that in the whole life cycle of the network and the systems implementations. Okay. Now, Microsoft, for instance, they have a specific time frame that they will release a new version of their operating system and even support application software, things like that. I was telling you guys a couple of days ago, I wept bitter tears when they finally pulled the plug on the Windows 7 Professional. In my opinion, Windows 7 and Windows XP to this day were the two easiest to use, most secure, easiest to configure operating system environments that Microsoft ever put out. And I really hated to see Windows 7 go. But now I will tell you, Microsoft seems to have upped their game a bit, in my opinion, with the latest version of Windows 11. It's a beautiful operating system. They've sort of tightened up on the massive amount of disk space and system requirements to run the OS. So they seem to have upped their game on, for instance, the internal troubleshooting functionality, the way the system runs, the lack of every other week having a new system upgrade, that kind of things. But they will go ahead and define a very specific lifetime for their particular version of the OS. And then once that comes around, they will extend it usually for a period of time, and then they pull support on it. Now, Mac OS doesn't do that. They will change the name and upgrade some functionality, but they don't stop supporting an old version. It just keeps going, gets better and better. So in that, the vendor sunset date is not as much an issue as it is in some of the Windows versions. Now, I'll tell you, Windows really got to step up their game, because Mac OS, their pricing has come down, where it's more even across the board than it has been in past years. Same thing with their hardware prices. The hardware prices have sort of evened out all across the board in different systems. The application software is becoming less and less expensive. Almost all your software vendors have changed their evil ways on the way that the licensing fees and the seat fees and things like that. But I'll tell you, the Linux distros, they're beginning to nip at the heels of both Windows and Mac OS, not only in because of the fact that they're free open source software, but the worldwide support on those things is just unbelievable. And they're being more and more accepted. So they're starting to claim a lot of that desktop space as people become more and more savvy with the systems, more and more aware of what they are. Now, in the Windows environment, we got a couple of different editions that are still out there. Mainly, we're looking at Windows 10, Windows 11. Like I say, they pulled support for Windows 7. Windows 8 was a big old swing and a miss anyway. I don't know anybody that ever ran that for more than a week or so. Now, most of your operating systems and the motherboards are 64-bit versions, 48-bit data paths, 64-bit processors, multi-core processors, that kind of thing. They the new version of the operating system has been updated to take advantage of all of that. There is 3 basic licensing flavors. There is your personal home user single license scale down function. You can have a single core CPU. I'm sorry, a single slot CPU, 64 cores on it that is capable. But it's got a limit of the amount of random access memory that is supported by the system, 128 gigabytes. And then as you go up with the processing requirements and the different versions of the operating environment, Windows Home sort of scaled down. It doesn't have some things built in, like doesn't have your hypervisor software automatically built in. Doesn't have automatic support for your BitLocker program, which is an encryption algorithm. Doesn't have automatic support for the encrypting file system. So the compression, the encryption, not automatically supported as part of the system. It would have to be add-on types of appliances there. Then we get into the professional license. Professional license actually comes in a couple of flavors as well. You can get a singular pro license. Now, it does give you the ability of doing the BitLocker to go, the compression algorithms. It gives you the ability of having, for instance, a remote engineer dialing in and taking control with that's the remote desktop protocol we talked about the other day. It has much more support for multi-core processors, and it up into the terabytes of support for RAM. And we also talked about day before yesterday I guess, the group policy object editor, the GPO editor, group policy and service policy objects that comes with the professional license and above too. And you get the hypervisor for free, the Hyper-V hypervisor software, where you can run virtualization on board on the computer system itself. Now, the next level of that is an enterprise licensing mode, and same functionality in individual licenses, but it's just the way the licenses are managed. You typically will install a license server inside of your organization, And then the installs on individual Windows machines will come from that server, not from, issuing individual licenses out there. And usually that type of install is performed from a server push down to each individual device. You can install these licenses from web download off the internet, that kind of thing. There's the characteristics of the Windows Professional and the Enterprise license. And the Enterprise and Education license, pretty much the same kind of thing. You have the capability of doing 2 terabytes of random access memory in the Windows Pro license. Now, of course, the hardware has to support it. It will also support, the operating system will, 2 different CPU slots on the motherboard and 128 cores per CPU. So some pretty heavy duty processing there. And those multiple cores on the CPU provides a function that we refer to as hyper-threading or multi-threading, where I can launch and control numerous program threads simultaneously. And I tell you, with that much main memory on a system, of course, I've never used a system with 2 terabytes of RAM, but even my little laptop here, I guess I'm running 128 gigabytes of RAM on this system, I believe. Got a single CPU, but it has 8 cores on it, so it's pretty heavy duty for a small laptop anyway. The Enterprise license, it goes even beyond that. 6 terabytes of RAM, 4 CPU slots that are supported on like server class machines, and 256 core total limit as far as the individual cores on those systems. Now, the Enterprise and the Education licenses are it's a volume licensing. You buy chunks of licenses in essence. And those licenses are managed by install licensing server that's set up somewhere in the network. Okay. So now those are the things that you need to really key on and be specific about. These guys here, okay, the number of CPUs, the core limit, the amount of RAM that the individual license versions will support. Same thing here. You need to memorize that stuff. Now, for me personally, I would make flashcards to study that stuff. Okay. Also, remember the BitLocker tool. This guy is with the professional license and above, and it's an encryption algorithm, and it's built right into the operating system. Now, there's also a version of it called BitLocker to go, which allows me to encrypt like portable devices, USB flash, SD cards, those kind of things. And it also includes that other function called EFS, encryption file system. BitLocker will allow me to encrypt a single disk partition or now an entire disk drive, and I can come up with a key to unlock or to unencrypt it. The BitLocker to go, same thing, but for mobile devices, portable devices. And EFS, on the other hand, the encrypting file system, allows me to encrypt a singular file or an entire folder on the disk, not the entire disk partition, that kind of thing. You got to be very cautious on using those encryption algorithms. Don't lose the key. So you have to jump through major hurdles and may even have to purchase ridiculously expensive software to help you figure out what the key is if you forget it. So now, as far as installing the operating system, do it in a couple of ways. According to the version of the operating system you're wanting to go to, you may have to go through, the existing versions between where you are and where you want to get. Some of them, however, the upgrade path, you can go directly. Excuse me. When I was getting ready to do my upgrades, I just decided to leapfrog right over Windows 10 onto Windows 11, but I had to go through Windows 10 to get to 11. Okay? So the upgrade path is in some cases very specific. You can decide to do that in path or in place upgrade, or you can decide just to strip it down to the bare metal and reload everything from the metal up. It's all according to the number of systems you're having to do, the type of upgrades you're going to do, and the the way that you're going to be doing it. Is it a manual thing? Are you pushing it from a web server? That kind of thing. The main thing about this, just like most of the stuff that we did instructions, understand what the instructions are, read those, make certain that the systems you are going to, especially from a hardware perspective, are going to be compatible, are going to support the version of the OS that you're going to be loading on. Told you guys yesterday, Windows came very close to losing, a whole crowd of users when they introduced Windows Vista, because they did this fabulous marketing campaign talking about all of the virtue, as it were, of the new Windows Vista operating system, where they failed, in my opinion, miserably. They didn't inform the public this operating system requires some heavy duty hardware upgrades for most of you. And like I say, people got it, they loaded it on the system, and then the system was just crawling along, limping along, because they just didn't have the horsepower, the configuration, etc., to support the stuff. Okay. All right, gents, let's dive on over here. I want you guys real quickly to jump in and do your lesson quiz on this guy. Now, we're not going to worry about repeating the previous lesson quiz. I'm hoping you guys will do that on your own, and we'll repeat these later on, as we go through the day here. This one is short and sweet, only 10 questions total. Now, those of you folks that are joining us on YouTube, just hang with us here. This is going to be short and sweet. I will be running a timer. And of course, folks, when you get through with your quiz, post those scores in your chat box. Okay. Own those scores and be proud of them. Okay. So I'm going to set up a quick 10 minutes on your time clock here. That ought to give you plenty of time to do this. You guys probably finish it prior to that. But like I say, you folks on out there in the wild, hang with us. We're going to be back at it here in a short 10 minutes. All right, folks, go for it. Enjoy. Looking forward to your scores here. All right, gents. Thank you all for owning those scores. I appreciate that. Well done on those. And remember, it's all good news. You know what you know what you need to work on. And that repetition, when you do it again and again, there you go, Kevin. Immediately bumped it up, almost double the score there. That's the way to do it there, buddy. And that repetition is absolutely supported with all kind of metrics to drive that stuff home. And every time you do it, you get better at it. Every time you do it, you get better at it. So well done. Glad you guys are taking the initiative to do just that. All right, we're going to go ahead and clear this timer and dive on into our next lesson here. Okay. Now, this guy, this one here gets more in depth into the installation, specifically of the different methods that we go through installing operating system environments, as well as some of the troubleshooting things that we do and some of the tools that are embedded inside of the operating systems themselves for helping us to do troubleshooting functions there. Okay. Now, we looked at a couple of the command line functions yesterday. We'll take a look at some more of those here. Now, I gave you guys the links on the wormhole for you to download those files, the all command reference files and the acronym list that I told you guys about. Make sure you go to that and download those, because that link will expire, I think, mid-morning today. So make sure you get that. Now, the installation process on the operating systems, it varies based upon the type of the operating system that you're going to be doing. There's basically 3 different flavors of installs that we can do. You can do an attended or a manual install, to where you go down to around to each individual host machine, and you have a USB flash drive or a DVD or a disk pack or whatever that contains the predefined operating system install. You plug it in and run the install manually, attended. And as I was saying, that all along the way in the attended installation, it will pause and prompt the user, whoever the installer happens to be, to enter in information. And that is asking questions on disk path that you're going to store this file in, what kind of credentials you're installing, how much disk space you're going to allocate for this or that, and so on. You can do like I was saying earlier, a clean from the metal up, bare bones install, or you can do an in-place upgrade where you upgraded, for instance, from Windows 10 to Windows 11. I tell you, the later versions of the Windows install are pretty time consuming. Even if you set it up to run in an unattended mode, being pushed down from like a domain network server or something like that, they're pretty lengthy per system, but it's loading a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of stuff on. You have to make certain that the hardware you're installing on is compatible, that it will indeed support the operating system and all of the supporting files and so on that you're trying to install. When you look at the install documentation, it'll tell you what the base level hardware requirements are. And I'm talking about everything from the type of CPU, the speed of the CPU, the amount of random access memory you have, the amount of available disk space that you have, things like that. You always want to, especially if you're doing in-line, in-place upgrades on an OS, you want to back up everything. You want to back up an image of the system, and I'm talking, when I say image, the configuration, the hardware, software configuration, software installs, everything about that particular system. You want to back up that template as well as any user data that is stored on that system. User data, which includes the configuration, user profile configurations, the Windows registry configuration, everything there needs to be backed up. And I have had network engineers shot themselves in the foot because they're thinking, oh, yeah, no, we're just doing in-place upgrade. I'm not worried about it. And boom, something would blow up and erase user files. Of course, we always, they always had backups of those, but that was just additional time and effort that they had to do for doing the clean and the reinstall and the restore and things like that. You'll find too, especially if you're installing new equipment, new hardware, or if you're installing an operating system upgrade that actually negates or deletes old device drivers, old configuration files, things like that, where you'll need to make certain that you have those. And remember, every external peripheral component has to have some type of device driver. And that's like I look at it sort of like a translator file. A device driver that sits in the middle between an operating system and a printer, for instance. It informs the operating system of what the printer's characteristics and capabilities are, and informs the printer of what the operating system's characteristics and capabilities are. So it's sort of a messaging conduit, if you will, wrapped up in a file that you need to install for that specific piece of peripheral hardware there. Okay. Sometimes the operating systems are set up in an automated, in an unattended mode. That's pretty clever. You create what they refer to as an answer file. And there's actually a program, applet, that's available in Windows that will allow you to go in and create this as an unattended installation where I can just push it down from a network server, something like that. And the answer file provides the stock answers, or the answers that you want to apply when the system would normally halt the installation process and prompt you to enter in something on the keyboard. The answer file supplies those answers. Now, especially if you're doing a installation on multiple machines. To give you an example, a company I worked with several years back, we had 5 classrooms that were they taught different classes in week to week. And our network engineer, Joe, poor guy, was in there, all weekend long, just reconfiguring the computer systems in the classroom because he had not been able to get his automated, unattended installation whole process put together and wrapped up and working properly. So I took pity on the guy and I mean, and I'm nobody's expert on this stuff, but he and I got in there one weekend, and I mean, we worked all weekend long and finally came out of it with complete unattended installation for the bulk of all the different classes that were being taught there. And I mean, we taught a whole range of stuff. We taught all the IBM, I mean, the Microsoft Office products. We taught the Google Docs education. We taught, of course, all of CompTIA, the A plus, Network plus, Security plus, the cybersecurity classes, everything. And, you know, I guess we had 8 different instructors that taught classes in there periodically. And Joe would have to go through it, you know, in this classroom over here. This week it may be introduction to Microsoft Excel. Well, next week it may be advanced Microsoft Access, you know, program. And so we set up all of his templates, and you actually set it up or we did set it up to be a network install or download or a push from a network server, and they call it. I mean, the version of it is Pixie. We called it pre-boot execution environment. We would set up the answer file. We'd set up the image for for each of the classes, and then the network server would push that down and just basically rubber stamp those images onto all the systems in whatever classroom we were configuring there. And boy, did it! Joe did a happy dance in the street, especially because we worked with it over a period of about 3 weeks, and finally got all the kinks out and got it where it was automated, and he could run it from home. He didn't even have to come into the center there unless something went wrong. So the Pixie boot function there is very, very common now used. You can do some of the installation and drive it from a DHCP server. That's certain things that I can do there, especially if it relates to configuring the IP addressing and setting up the network interface card configuration, things like that. And like I say, you can have the system. You can go down originally around to each individual machine with a disk or a USB flash drive or a portable disk drive, whatever, and do it manually. I'm old crusty dude and maybe got a little bit of lazy streak personally, so I prefer this automated thing, you know, if I can do just that. So, but whatever the methodology, whatever the method you want to set it up to do the install and then even boot the systems up, there's even in this Pixie environment too, I can have a whole host of like classroom or department computers that the install is not on them individually. It actually boots from and downloads what it needs from a network server. That's part of that Pixie environment as well. So multiple methods of actually loading and or booting from a centralized location. Now, inside all of your system, doesn't matter what the operating system is, doesn't matter what the version of it is, doesn't matter pretty much what the hardware is. All systems, when you start the machine up, goes through some type of a boot up process. Most all of the operating systems also go through, and I mentioned it earlier in the week, that post operation, that power on self-test operation. And it reads information from the master boot record in order to know how to boot the system up and how the system is configured, that kind of thing. Some systems call it the MBR, the master boot record. Some systems call it the boot sector. Some people calls it the partitioning table. You know, whatever the nomenclature is there, it is the information. Typically, the primary partition on the first disk drive that contains all the information that tells the system how it's going to be configured and how it's going to run and how it's going to boot up. You see. It'll tell the certain things in that post operation. I mentioned that the other day. It sends out these signals or these queries, if you will, and ask each individual major component, are you there and are you healthy? And that's part of the whole boot process. Okay. Now, in just about all of your operating systems as well, when you go through the install, you have the option, and sometimes it's just a default function. The system will set up what's referred, it partitions an area on the disk and loads up what we call a recovery partition. So that later on down the line, if something goes awry, I can basically roll the system back and reset it to the original factory install. Okay? And it reads that recovery information from that recovery partition. Now, the first part of the week, when we looked at the BIOS menu, one of the things that I can identify and manage in that BIOS menu is this, where this recovery partition resides. What partition on the disk actually contains the master boot record and the recovery partition. Okay. I can even have that recovery as an external on a DVD or USB flash drive and boot the system there if I wish. In addition to that, during the install process, I can have the system set up. A function is called snapshotting, so that periodically, and I decide pretty much what the frequency is going to be. As I'm just operating along every day in my normal operations, it will periodically take a system snapshot. In the virtual world, the virtual machines, they call it a checkpoint. Well, some of them now are starting to call it snapshot as well. But it's a rollback point that is established by the system, and it does it periodically on whatever frequency I set up. So I can sort of restore the system back to a point in time configuration by using that snapshot or that checkpoint, as it were. Okay. In going in and doing OS repairs or system repairs, I showed you guys the other day. You get into that under the covers BIOS and menu there, the startup menu, and I can refresh the system back to original factory reset, or I can back it up to one of the snapshots. I can decide to restore all of my operating system stuff, but keep my user files, or I can decide just to wipe the whole thing clean and get back to the way it was when I did the original install. And I make those decisions when I get down under the covers there with that. Now, here is a couple of labs here that you guys definitely need to go through. Okay. Now, if you've never done an install of a Windows environment, never done an install with a Linux environment, this will step you through each and every bit of the details for each one of those. Okay. So definitely going to do these labs. Probably will assign these as homework. But those are, and as A+ technicians, you need to know how to do these things, no doubt. Now, as far as answering questions on your exam, these really sort of, goes around the periphery of that. They're not going to provide any more information than we have in the lecture, nor than what you'll get from your in the lesson quizzes. But this is definitely something that you need to get a handle on, because I just bet $1 to a donut as an A+ technician, you're going to be required to load operating system. Primarily, more than likely, it's going to be Windows, but it could very well be other OS as well. Okay. Now, once I get the OS actually installed, then I have to set up, install, and configure application programs. And whatever the requirement of the job function is that you're putting the computer together for, or ginning the computer up for, well, that's application software you need to run. A couple of very important things that you have to determine is will the hardware that I'm loading this stuff on, does it actually support it? Is the application software requirement for this job function, is it something that will run under Windows? Is it something that I need Mac OS, or is it something that may be better served with a Linux distro? Okay, I got to understand the application requirements as far as what kind of speed am I needing with the CPU? For instance, if I'm doing some application like a CAD/CAM design program, three-dimensional design program, that takes a lot of mighty fast processor speed, large amounts of RAM, main memory, may even require massive storage space on the system. So I have to predetermine all of that. And the application software will more than likely give you at the least a very foundational requirement for being able to install and run that application program. Okay. So again, you got to read the instructions, look at the information that is more often than not provided by the vendor of the application. Okay. And think about, things such as too, if I'm setting up a system for doing web design or audio recording or video editing, things like that. There's very specific hardware requirements there that are designed for doing like 3D graphics manipulation in a 3D world, things like that. Now, I was telling you guys about our recording studio. We originally were doing Mac OS hardware there. And I mean, because, the audio recording is massive file sizes, especially if you're doing multi-track recording. And you go in the analog to digital, digital analog conversion real time. So the Macintosh systems are custom made for that kind of thing. Okay. You have to make certain that the operating system software is compatible with whatever application that you're trying to run, and vice versa. For instance, most of your operating systems are backward compatible for older application software. I've still got, I guess, 2 pieces of old app software that I still run on this computer, and it was old 32-bit software that I ran on my Windows XP system way back when. I love the packages. I still use them regularly. The new Windows version has backward compatibility for those, but I couldn't go in the other direction. Okay. I can't run 64-bit application software on an old 32-bit machine. Just won't work. Most of the OSs, though, are backward compatible. If you got 64-bit, it will run many of the 32-bit older applications, but not in the other direction there. Okay. So you got to make certain that the operating system supports the application from a hardware and a software support perspective there as well. Now, most of your operating system environments will use some type of an executable kind of program. Microsoft has 2 different flavors, well, 3 now, but 2 major flavors. They will run an exe file, which .exe is the executable. Any idea how programs like Wine run Windows, programs on Linux and Mac? Oh yeah, well you can run it. That's a good question there, by the way. I'm not sure. Are you saying any idea on how programs like Wine run Windows programs on Linux and Mac? I'm not sure what are you referring to with Wine. I'm not familiar with that program, James. Or is that a mistype? Yeah. You can run Windows programs on Mac and Mac programs on Windows if you run virtual machines. For instance, very often I will run on my laptop here, which it's running the primary host operating system here is Windows 11, but I run my VirtualBox hypervisor that I gave you guys a link to the other day from Oracle, and I can set up a virtual machine and run a Mac OS inside it, so I can run whatever Mac applications I want to there. I can set up a virtual machine and run my Poly Linux or the Ubuntu Linux and run whatever Linux applications in that virtual machine. Now, Mac systems also has a function, and this is one of the last things I think that was sort of a kumbaya moment between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs before Jobs passed away. There is a function in the Mac system called Boot Camp, to where you can load a Windows application on the Macintosh system and at boot time decide to boot up in Windows or Mac. Can't run them simultaneously, but you can boot up into either or. So I've seen that used quite a bit in that particular environment there. Okay. Heather, I see you have joined the party here as an audit student. I want to welcome you. And I want to encourage you, if you wish anyway, to participate. If there's any questions that you have while we are going through the lecture portion here, I invite you to jump in and ask the questions. We always consider that an opportunity, not an interruption. So welcome, enjoy your stay, and again, feel free to participate if you wish. So again, there to answer your question, James, yes, you can run those, but it requires the operating system that supports the application. And the better way to do that nowadays would be run some kind of hypervisor software, like Oracle Box or the Microsoft. Their hypervisor is called Hyper-V. Okay, so you can run whatever you want to pretty much inside those OSs. In the Windows environment, as I was saying, it uses two basic types of install files, the exe file and the MSI file. The Macintosh environment uses two different, they call it package installers. There's one called PKG and one called DMG, and those are file types and installer package installers. And then in the Linux environment, based upon whether you have a what's called a Debian based Linux distribution or a Red Hat based Linux distribution, they have two different installer programs there. And for instance, like the Ubuntu, those guys, Mint, several other of the Linux distributions, they use the APT installer is what it's called. And then the others, the Red Hat, use an installer called Yum, YUM. And you know, same kind of, it's a file, a package installer, a package manager, whatever you want to call it. But it's very specific to those type of operating systems. Now, also in the Linux environment, and I get this downloaded periodically for two of my Linux distributions. It comes down as a file type called ISO, and they refer to it as a mountable file type for Linux distributions. I run my Kali Linux distribution. I get updates on that from a server that is located, I believe, up at MIT. And there's other servers spread out all over the country. Every now and then, every couple of weeks, I'll get a message saying, "Well, we've got a new update to the operating system or to some of the software. Do you want to download it?" And of course, I always do, and it comes down as an ISO file type. So I run it through the Debian APT package management software, and it installs everything on that. Things we need to also consider when we're doing updates and loads on operating systems in general is you want to make certain, and this is very important, you want to make certain that you are installing fully licensed software. You don't want to get caught in your environment, especially an enterprise environment, but you know, as well in a personal environment of installing pirated software. There's some mighty stiff fines and penalties associated with that. The FCC enforces that rule pretty well, as a matter of fact. You want to make certain that, you know, whatever time, effort, and resource is going to be required. Oh, okay. I see that you updated that, the wine. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I'm just not familiar with that one at all. I guess it's an installer kind of program of some sort. I'm not familiar with it yet, but I will be later on this afternoon. So you want to make certain that you know you are using fully licensed software. You want to make certain that the software falls within whatever compliance templates that your company or you may be bound by. And some of that compliance stuff is enforced by force of law, regulations, rules, things like that. You want to make certain that, you know, that if you're doing a whole host of broad spread type of installs, you want to make certain that you're communicating with any and everybody that may be a stakeholder in that, may be affected by it. So if it's going to be, you know, causing work stoppage, things like that, you got to make certain everybody is well informed there. And you got to make certain that, you know, the applications and the operating systems that you're installing are going to be compatible with the environment you intend to install those on. Okay. I tell you, I'm a big fan of the Pixie install environment. It takes a little bit of doing as far as getting it set up properly on the front end. But after that, boy, does it save time, effort, and resource, no doubt about it. Okay. Now, if you've never installed an application on a Windows environment, which I bet $1 to a donut that all you guys have, this would be another good lab for you to go through. I think it steps through in one of the office systems, the office productivity suite type systems installs there. Now, you will run into certain things as you go through an install of a Windows operating environment, and there are certain things it will do to, or that some of them even baked into the process to help us troubleshoot that. I mentioned the post operation at the first of the week here, and it goes through it every time you boot the system up. It will highlight issues that you may be having specifically with hardware components. Remember, I gave you guys the link to the beep tones, the beep codes that you may encounter when you go through the post operation, and that circuitry that's baked right onto the motherboard that does this check process, and it basically confirms and sends out those queries and receives the reply back for all the major systems, starting with the power supply. Again, just basically conceptually ask that question: are you available and are you healthy? And if it makes that round and all of those systems respond in the affirmative, well, then you see the login logo and you're ready to log into the system. Okay. Down in the master boot record, or the primary sector that's on your first disk drive there, that's where they have a system that, and it's called different things. It's called your boot configuration database, your BIOS, your master boot record, or certain thing, different names sort of for the same thing there. But it's the basic code that is loaded up, starting with the chip level motherboard kernel code, they call it, that tells the system how it's configured, tells the system the software that you want to load up, background processes, the supporting information, device drivers, things like that need to be loaded up every time the system boots up. Okay? And you, as a system operator, can go in and pretty much configure that. Okay? Now, remember I told you guys too, the old version of it is known as BIOS, Basic Input Output System. The newer versions of it, which is much more secure environment, is called UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Same concept, later versions, more secure, more capability of doing a more in-depth configuration down under the covers there, down in almost at the firmware level of the motherboard itself. Okay. And I was telling you guys too how you get to the startup. When the system starts to boot up, when you first see the logo, start pressing F8, your F8 key. And that's pretty much universal now for just about all of the motherboard manufacturers. Okay, F8, and it will interrupt that boot process and put you into the startup menu. Now, remember too, the older systems that use BIOS, you don't have the mouse driver loaded as of yet. So you'll have to navigate through the menu with your arrow directional keys on the keyboard and use this function keys and the enter key and, different keys on the keyboard to navigate, select options, things like that. With the later versions, the UEFI systems, well, the mouse driver is loaded so you can navigate these things for the most part with a mouse. Okay. So here is your Windows recovery environment here. That's one of the advanced option things that we can get through typically from this menu here. And, we navigate around through this thing with the mouse button here. Notice one of the very important things I can get to right here, the command prompt. Okay. Very important that I see all of these items here now. That's why I told you guys yesterday, and why I gave you the command listing. There may be times that the boot process is interrupted for whatever reason, and you can't get to the graphic user interface. But I can get to that command prompt there, you see. Over here, this is where I do my complete system restore, and I decide where, what backup or what snapshot restore point I want to restore the system to. Okay. So lots of different functionality that I have available here on this startup menu, especially with the advanced options here. It's called the Windows Recovery Environment, Windows RE. Okay. So need to be aware of that. And I tell you, I would even play around and interrupt the boot process every now and then and see the options that are there. If I decide to do, or if I have a need to do a restore of my system, well, I can decide once again, do I want to restore the entire system? Do I want to do a rollback to a particular checkpoint or snapshot time frame? Do I want to restore only my user files and leave the OS alone, or vice versa? Do I want to restore all of the operating system files and keep my data? Okay. So I decide how I'm going to reset or restore the system in essence, if I need to do that. Okay. Now, I was talking about the snapshots. That also applies to your Windows updates, firmware updates, driver updates, things like that. The system tracks all of those by default in this installer applet area here. And, let's say I get infected with some kind of malware. If I can determine the point in time that the system became infected, I can go into this utility and roll back to a time prior to that infection, and then the infection is not there anymore. See, or let's say I go in and I download and install a new device driver for a printer or workstation or disk drive or whatever, and it starts causing problems. I can roll back to prior to that device driver installation there, and it removes whatever it is causing the problem there. You see, so and I make all that determination there, either using the system applets. There's the reset and recovery thing I was talking about. Keep my files or blow everything away. This will restore all of your system, remove any applications, operating system, restore all those, but keep my files, or just start the whole thing from the ground up and reload everything. Now that blows away everything. So that is yet another good idea to make certain that you maintain a regular, consistent system backup and data backup process, so that you don't need to roll back too far or have your data back up to date and your system configuration back up to date where it's useful for sure. Right? So, and that's part of that recovery image. When I originally set the OS up, I decide what all I'm going to keep on that recovery partition, that recovery image there. Now, certain things you will encounter, as far as basically when you start trying to boot a system up. Okay. And I'll tell you, I've run into this as well. I mentioned to you guys the file that I gave you to download to show you how to create the USB boot disk that runs a Linux distribution. Before I started using my hypervisor, that's how I actually demonstrated the use of Linux distros on my laptop. I would plug in the USB flash drive, boot the system up, and it would boot from that USB flash drive and run the Linux operating system. And then without thinking, I would just unplug the USB flash drive, power the system down. Well, the next time I try to boot the system, it's saying, "Hey, where's the USB flash drive with your OS?" No OS found here. Okay, my fault. I mean, I didn't go back and tell the system, "Oops, yeah, we're not booting from the USB flash drive this time. We're booting from the normal boot location on the disk drive there." Okay. I told you guys about the system utility, the msconfig utility. Well, I can go into that and make those appointments in, if you will, at the operating system. Okay, you boot from this partition on this disk drive. That's the primary boot location. Okay. Now, if you have situations, and this unfortunately is a sort of a flag that your system may have been infected with some kind of malware, or you may have some kind of file intrusion or malware that has damaged some of your system files. If your system all of a sudden, when it's going through the boot process, starts showing error messages or issues being, where it's just sluggish, slow, okay? That's a sign that you may need to either do a system clean, or that your system may be infected with some kind of malware. Or somewhere along the way, some of your your system files have been damaged or corrupted. And remember, I told you guys, files on a computer system can be damaged or corrupted, or even wiped clean with some crazy stuff. If you have a lightning storm come through your area, if the battery dies on your system, or somebody kicks the plug out of the wall, or power surges, things like that, all of those things are prone to corrupting or damaging systems that are on your computer system. Okay? And those are kind of things that cause sluggish performance on the machine, programs very, very slow to start up, system periodically for no particular reason just reboots. That could be both malware infections or damaged files that were caused by, for instance, a power surge or something like that in your environment. Always remember those troubleshooting steps that we talked about at the beginning of the week. A, try to figure out what's causing the problem. Okay. Come up with at least a theory as to what you think is causing it. Test the theory. If it proves out, then go forward with your plan to actually mitigate the problem. And it could be something like, say, as simple as reloading a device driver file, or it could be something as, as not really complicated, but as complex as reloading data files back to a certain recovery point in your system, that kind of thing. And it could just be reboot the machine. It may need a timeout. So that's the thing that a lot of folks tend not to do. They immediately go to the worst case scenario, which is, speaking of worst case scenario. Now, I hope you guys never, ever encounter this. We call it the blue screen of death. Right? The blue screen of death, more often than not, is triggering some major problem with your computer system. Now, in the old days, when this would come up, system would typically lock up, would have this large hexadecimal error code that would show up on the screen. We'd have to write that down and use that to further research and get back with Microsoft and say, well, here's the error code that it submitted. Now, in lots of cases, I love it, they're actually creating and displaying these quick response codes, these QR codes. Pull out your mobile phone, scan that code, it immediately gives you a website link to go to. And then in many cases, that's what I was saying, Microsoft now has really upped their game on doing the automated kind of troubleshooting. And it may take you directly to a website that says, here's the problem, here's what you do to fix it. Okay. But blue screen of death, more often than not, says, well, you got a pretty major problem, even in some cases with hardware. You may have a bad RAM card, or you may have so many bad sectors on your disk drive it's not usable anymore, that kind of thing. So do the further research. Diagnostics there will show up oftentimes underlying the QR code, and take all kind of notes, call in help if necessary. And I'll tell you, Microsoft's troubleshooter, now up until actually about midway through Windows 10 version, I wouldn't have given you a plug nickel for all of Microsoft's troubleshooting software because it just didn't produce any results. I'll tell you, they have really upped their game, or it appears so anyway, in two specific areas with the troubleshooter I'm talking about. In networking and in printer support, I've seen quite the shift of that tool becoming more and more valuable, in my opinion, to help truly troubleshoot issues that are occurring with networking functions and with printer support functions too. Okay. Now, I told you about this guy right here, the time drift. Okay. If your system won't keep good time, you go in and set the date and time, and it just drifts. That is that CMOS battery, that real-time clock, RTC, they call it real-time clock battery. And it's on the motherboard for most of the motherboard systems. And usually now, the modernized ones, I think I told you guys this earlier, you don't take the old battery out, you just pop a new one in on top of it. And it's sort of a spring-loaded thing. That way, you don't have to rekey any changes that were made to the BIOS or the master boot record setup. Okay. In some cases, if you've got application programs that are just, again, for no particular reason, crashing. And you've seen it. I know this. You have an app screen running, and all of a sudden you get the spinning circle of death there, and up at the top it says app not responding. That may be a situation where you need to go to the program application window. And remember, I told you guys a couple of days ago, most of the application vendors now are including, as part of the install, a repair function. So highlight the app that's misbehaving and try to do the repair function. And that also, it scans to make certain that all of the program files that support that application are in good order. And if not, it will attempt to restore those from either a holding area or in some cases online. So, and just about all of your major software vendors now are beginning to include that repair function. You go to the programs and features of Applet that we looked at the day before yesterday, I guess, and troubleshoot those kind of things there. Okay. But I tell you, one of the very first things you'll want to do if you start having those issues, reboot the computer system. The reboot just clears out all of main memory. It clears out any temporary files, things that may be bogging up the works, misconfigurations between application programs. It clears out that kind of stuff as well. So give that a try, and then very systematically begin to troubleshoot the issue itself, and follow very carefully that troubleshooting methodology we've already gone over a couple of times here. Okay. All right. If you would be so kind, let's move on over to, yep, good timing there. Let's move on over to your quizzes. Now, you folks on YouTube, I'm about to pull the plug on you guys. I thank you for joining us there. And we'll be broadcasting again a little bit probably later on this afternoon. So check us out there. You guys won't be able to go through this practice quiz stuff. But again, I thank you all for joining us there. And good Lord willing, then the creek don't rise. We'll see you down the road sometime in one of our classes. So thank you all. Take care, and we'll see